hi, Mark. I already made you co-host, so I think we can start if all the authors are here.
All right. Hello, everybody. Thanks, and welcome to the fourth and final Game AI track at FDG, where the first paper will be by Alexander Gallo and Penny Sweetser. And I guess, David, you know which ones are videos and which are live.
Yes, just give me a sec, double checking it.
Yeah.
This
one's going to be a hybrid approach to procedural generation of roguelike game levels. It's going to combine two existing approaches with some arguments for why the result is advantageous.
Hello, I'm Penny Sweetser from the Australian National University. In this video, I'll present the work of one of my honours students, Alex Gallo, on a hybrid approach to procedural generation of roguelike video game levels. I'll follow the same structure as the paper, covering the key points. Please refer to the paper for the full details and feel free to contact me for more information. Our paper presents an approach to level generation in roguelike dungeon-style levels based on an examination of previous approaches to procedural content generation. Our generator aims to create simple dungeon style level layouts that are always playable. We utilize a hybrid approach combining context-free grammars to generate a description of levels and a cellular automata inspired process to generate the physical space. Our generator proved successful at consistently generating dungeon layouts that maintain completability at all times with sufficient variation. We conclude that there is substantial value in hybrid approaches to automated level design and propose a new heuristic by which to assess dungeon-style level content. Rogue is a classic dungeon crawler from 1980, in which the player explores a simple, randomly generated dungeon, with the game resetting after each player death. Rogue gave rise to the roguelike or roguelite genre of games, which is loosely defined by randomized levels and permanent player death. Roguelikes are the main application area for procedural content generation in commercial games, due to their reliance on every play session being fresh. Some well-known examples include The Binding of Isaac and Dungeons of Dreadmore. Roguelikes are also used as a training ground for artificial intelligence. Procedural content generation is the algorithmic generation of data, as opposed to manual creation of input. It offers the potential for infinite content and variation for each play session. Recent high-profile games, such as Minecraft with its procedurally generated worlds, and Fortnite Battle Royale with its random distribution of weapons for players to pick up, have shown that randomness and frequent variation in game content are valuable traits for a game's longevity and success. It also offers the ability to create unique experiences for a game, which allows players to create their own personal emergent stories. Many different approaches have been used for procedural content generation in games, each with its own relative strengths and weaknesses. Our paper reviews the different approaches and presents a side-by-side comparison of the strengths and weaknesses, as you can see here. Many approaches have strengths that oppose the weaknesses of others, which suggests that a hybrid approach could effectively combine complementary techniques to minimize weaknesses. I won't go into the details of the review here, but we select and combine the structure of grammars to generate mission descriptions with the randomness of cellular automata-inspired behavior to generate level spaces. We use a classic 2D top-down dungeon inspired by roguelikes and functionally similar to The Legend of Zelda. Dungeons are neither linear nor open world. Designers must impose structural rules to define where a player can explore, while ensuring the spaces are sufficiently complex. Lock-key pairs or similar break the level into subsections so that the player must explore the level and overcome obstacles to access the next section. For a level to be playable, all keys must be reachable before their intended locks. Our generator focuses on producing levels to ensure that subsections are controllable and completable. We selected generative grammars to define missions. We recursively generate a single string, which is used to describe as an intended order of room types that a player will visit. The grammar rules enforce the generation rule, so only valid missions are generated. The mission generator rules enforce any necessary structure that might be difficult for the space generator. We start each generation with a rule defining a start and end point and recursively fill in the content. We use a simple recursive grammar designed to output similar but varied descriptions for the space generator. We selected a cellular automata-inspired approach to generate the physical spaces that complement the mission descriptions. The single string from the mission generator is given to the space generator. Rooms are placed one at a time in the order described by the string. At any given time, a single room is considered the current active cell. The generator attempts to move to an empty cell to place the next room. We use two variants of the rules. In the first variant, only the immediate neighbourhood is considered. In the second, we search in a randomly selected direction branching from the current section. We call this a subsection search, and it allows the space to appear as though it is growing around a natural cluster. We test two search approaches, a persistent subsection search that always uses the subsection search, and a subsection search on halt that uses the subsection search when the local search fails. We devised a bespoke evaluation heuristic for comparing the interestingness of the generated content. We wanted a way to measure the semi-linearity to evaluate levels for being both structured and encouraging exploration. Our heuristic considers two possible paths through a dungeon. The critical path is the shortest path to complete a level by finding all keys and taking them to all locks. The spine is the shortest possible path between the start and end. Our heuristic calculates the total difference in length between these two paths. The larger the path difference, the more a player needs to explore the map to find the keys. Critical path alone would encourage a single long winding path, whereas the difference between the two paths rewards short spines with branches for exploration. The subtractive value also helps to normalize the value across different sized dungeons. The generator is constructed in two parts. I won't go into the details on the implementation, but the mission generator is a Python script sentence generator, and the space generator is constructed in the Unity game engine. Each space generation rule was tested for 500 generated levels and automatically evaluated both for completability and against the path difference heuristic using pathfinding between the critical points. All tests were conducted on a single manually selected mission description consisting of 58 rooms and 8 lock key pairs. Results of the path difference heuristic were collected alongside completability information for the two subsection search variants. we found that both variants of the subsection search could always generate completable levels with some amount of forced endings, and that persistent subsection search performed better in terms of our heuristic. The persistent subsection search appeared to generate a more varied distribution of rooms than the subsection search on halt, with fewer long uninteresting corridors that lacked freedom to explore. We can conclude that the path difference heuristic functions as intended, scoring higher on levels that appeared less linear in their overall layout. The aesthetic results of our generator are in line with similar experiments in the field, producing varied dungeon layouts that feel both familiarly structured yet varied. Our generator works as a constructive procedural content generation method as it can create completable levels. Our heuristic could also be used as a search-based approach. Our results suggest that hybridized generative techniques are an effective means of producing interesting, procedurally generated content, which is worthy of further investigation. Our two selected techniques were able to effectively complement each other's generative weaknesses, with the grammar rules providing a structured order that was not too rigid, and the non-deterministic automata providing varied and sufficiently random spaces. Thanks for listening. Please feel free to contact me if you have any questions about this paper or about any of our other work.
All right, so that was the first paper. Unfortunately, I believe neither of the authors is here. If I'm wrong and you are, please say something. But I don't see them in the participants list. So if that's the case, then if you have questions, you can feel free to contact the authors, but we can't take questions here. So we'll move on to the second paper then, which is by Martin Pichelmeyer and Charlene Putney, on procedural generation for divination and inspiration. So in a way, another PCG paper, but a very different kind of PCG paper. They have a much different goal than the usual one.
All right, yes, I am here, and this will be a live presentation, and I will just quickly set up the sharing in the method that Marie used for her keynote. I learned from her. So you should see my screen. Do you see my screen?
I see a purple screen.
Yes, that is good. Perfect. Thank you. Good. Okay, so yeah, thank you, Mark, for the introduction. My paper is, or our paper is, as mentioned, about procedural generation for divination and inspiration. My name is Martin Pichelmeyer. Char is also here in the chat, and this, I'm happy to answer questions if there are any after the presentation. And otherwise, just get started. My general motivation for this particular kind of work is that I'm somehow interested in the effective and emotional quality of interactivity in general, independent of games or whatever technology. And in particular, I somehow was interested in looking or in just playing with using procedural generation techniques to affect some factors of everyday life, as opposed to just making something that is somehow strictly framed as a game. And that comes from a long history of just looking at technology in its, and how it, I don't know, becomes a part of our habits and so on. Originally starting out as a media artist, like 20, soon 25 years ago, actually, where I made a lot of exhibition pieces like this converted pinball machine. And then I worked in the industry for a couple of years where we tried to make different games, like Old Man's Journey, that is our most famous title that I wasn't personally involved in, but it's I'm co-owner or co-founder of the company, so I just claim it here. And nowadays I'm back in academia and I'm looking at the tools, design tools, mixed initiative tools, a lot that enhance game feel or help you in designing this the surface of games, the friction of games, the feel of games. Shar, on the other hand, is a writer, a professional writer who has worked on actual big video games that you might have heard of, and is fascinated by our ability as humans to find meaning in chaos and to see patterns. And that is somehow what brought us together to look at crazy things and to try out how we can push what can be done with procedural generation a little bit. And in this concrete paper, I'm writing about 4+1 projects. The first of which is a Twitter bot called Haikukies that creates fortune cookie haikus if you send it a tweet. This is barely, so I'm sending a live tweet now to request one of the cookies. No, it doesn't want to send that. Yes, cool. So I send it a tweet and it will answer in a few minutes with a kind of fortune for our future. And how it exactly works is actually well documented in the paper and much easier if you just read it up instead of me describing it here. But it just uses tracery and cheatbots done quick to assemble a proper haiku, and I will just read what it will wish us when it comes back. This is super dangerous. Let's see. In general, procedural generation is, as you of course all know, just a method of designing that makes you a meta designer. So you make a kind of example piece that informs you about the design constraints, then you try to encode them in a system, and then you just kick off the system and it shoots off bowl of oatmeal after bowl of oatmeal, and then you have to somehow sift through all this oatmeal. I love that, by the way. This is, at least there is a Google result I get when I'm looking for 10,000 bowls exactly of oatmeal. I guess the next 9,000 are actual oatmeal. Of course, you can, in practice, you would use more sophisticated approaches. For example, making procedural generation with machine learning methods like GPT-2, 3 nowadays. You curate a corpus that you use to fine train this system that is already trained on a much larger corpus, and then you curate or create or write prompts that trigger the system, and in order to bounce it into a specific direction, and then you would maybe even use, be careful to moderate the output in a way that makes it higher quality. This is basically how The Guardian last week published a GPT-3 piece by just having it actually write 8 pieces, 8 essays, and then cutting and pasting them together in order to have one coherent and fascinating text. That's not cheating, it's just the way how you can work with those systems and maintain a high enough level of quality to turn the heads of the audience. So it makes a lot of sense. But let's look at the word divination that I provocatively used in the title of this paper. Divination is this old technique, very old, I don't know how old, but very old, of using randomization in order to kind of shut out the human factor from the observation of nature, in order to to perceive the grand plan that is out there and determining your fate. Which is, of course, a questionable practice. This is a super interesting example, actually. There's a nice paper references later about this specific die, because it's a Greek die that the Romans brought to Egypt, and now it has Egyptian names of gods, and they assume that it's used for oracular practices, but it's kind of new technology from 100, from the year 100. One of the other experiments I'm writing about in this paper, or we're writing about in this paper, actually I've written the papers, but we've done the projects together, is Nostradamus, which is a Nostradamus remix bot where I just took several, I think hundreds or at least dozens of quatrains, which is a format that Nostradamus wrote his prophecies in, of the original Nostradamus text, and filtered them for only prophecies that contain the word will, and then just swap randomly the 2 sides of what is left and what is right of the word will in order to get new prophecies. This is most likely more or less how he was able to write hundreds of prophecies himself. So most likely he already used a form of manual procedural generation. Well, the results are, of course, rather hilarious. Most of them use very outdated concepts like, I don't know, Proteus and duels and stuff like that. Obsolete objects, swords and chalices all over the place, a lot of blood also. And in the best case, they are actually quite entertaining, like by night the rainbow will pass by the sea in infinite numbers. Whatever it means, this is the future we are all going to face. The criticism of the fortune-telling and divinatory practices is older than the die I showed before, in that, for example, Cicero already wrote a whole book criticizing divination as actually being impossible, because if fate is determined, then it's not really looking into the future, it's anyway given, and if fate is not determined, we can't look into the future, so divination can't exist. At the same time, divination exists for a reason that is, of course, has very little to do with the world and a lot to do with us as human beings, in that the act of divination itself is, of course, something that modern divination practices are far more interested in. So tarot, for example, is more used as a kind of lens to look at your life and to show you what other possibilities you have, to look at your current situation, then it is actually used in order to say, oh, the fool, and predict the future in this Hollywood way. So divination is maybe just a technique of inspiration, of telling you how to go about life. The Surrealists as an arts movement, as a group of people, was also very interested in techniques that would exclude consciousness from the art practice, from creative practice in that case. And they actually were interested in tarot, and even designed their own tarot deck at some point, but they used it for playing card games instead of predicting the future. So it's kind of definitely not a divinatory practice they had. Another project that we're writing about in this paper is Tiferet, which is a GPT-2 based project where we used Aleister Crowley's book of, I guess it's pronounced Thoth or Thoth or Thought, a book about tarot, and then prompted the system with the names of tarot cards in order to create these evocative texts that you can then use as some kind of inspiration. We didn't even put the prompts on it, so you don't know what card you're holding in your hand. I can just recommend reading them. The link is in the paper to this project. You can just download it from itch. I think it's definitely an evocative result, I would say. The graphics are actually SVGs that were also generated with Tracery, so they are also procedural. This technique of making cards that you can somehow use as a concrete inspiration is also something that has been around. After the Surrealists, the Situationists were the next art movement that somehow tried to use random in creative ways in order to jolt you out of a creative situation where you were stuck in your creative project. And Brian Eno and Peter Schmidt created the oblique strategy cards in 1975. It's a deck of cards that you can just use when you need some kind of outside whack on the head, on the inside of the head, on the brain, basically, to push you a little bit out, a little bit forward, a little bit out of your impediment. For example, make a sudden destructive, unpredictable action. I will not do that right now. It's unpredictable enough when I'm giving a live presentation. Again, the Surrealists, what they also invented is Exquisite Corpse, which is this game where you draw and then you fold over 90% of the drawing and someone else continues the drawing and you get this stream of consciousness of several people drawings, multiplayer drawings, basically. The interesting thing about that is that it's a bit, by making a rule set like that, it's actually the human who does the procedural generation. So they give the procedure and you generate as a human. But the idea was, again, to somehow take the conscious, rational thinking away from the creative process. Another method that was very popular back then and is still in art is just to be very strict with your constraints when it comes to form. The Oulipo movement would be a classical example that came out of situationism. Of that Oulipo movement that movement produced a couple of books where, for example, the letter E is not used, and things like that, or poetry where the shape of the poem has an influence or is kind of set, so you can actually explore within this framework very freely. Twitter is, of course, also extremely restrictive in how much content you can fit and what kind of content actually is Twitterable content. And this is such a super good playground for these kinds of experiments. 5000 Vampire, this project named itself, so that is why it has this particular name, is a recipe bot that we created that not only creates recipes you can in theory cook, at least nothing speaks against doing so, except for maybe culinary thoughts. But in any case, it gives you not only a list to follow like most recipe creation software out there, but instead it actually gives you a kind of a challenge. Can you cook a dish with this specific set of steps and ingredients that are mentioned? And it also gives you some instructions on how to eat or how to cook or what to think about while eating or cooking in order to, I don't know, to give you a new cooking experience. We've cooked following it, and it was actually always good, which has, I think, maybe very little to do with the recipe itself. But you should really try to eat with your oldest knives and carefully contemplate the aesthetics of your color palette of food. In general, I think we kind of succeeded in squeezing these particular the procedural generation tools into the lives of people. We have some hard learnings and some soft or higher level learnings. The lower level learnings are in the paper and I leave them there. In general, the learnings are not revolutionary. It's like, yeah, iterative processes, tight iterative processes are very good for reaching a certain level of quality. Creating your source data and really cleaning it up is super important. Which GPT model size you use for a project like Tiferet is really not that relevant. Curation is much more important. Carefully balancing surprise and familiarity is what actually connects with everyday life of people. We have some future thoughts of where to take this, like automated game design, having a bit more structure in there, creating more tools. One tool that is also in the paper was created in the process of working on this because I was somehow unhappy with every tracery editor, so I just wrote my own. It's freely available, feel free to use it. And that's basically it. So let's have a look if we got a message. Did we get a message from my cookie? We got 3 messages. Features shine brightly, dreams in harbor is harsh, oceans come and go. Well, that's what they do, I guess. Okay, with this, I am actually done. Thank you for listening.
All right, thank you, Martin. We have time for maybe one question or so. You took up most of your presentation slot, which is totally fine.
Yeah, I know, I'm sorry.
But if anyone has a question, feel free to either type it or use the little hand raise thing and I can unmute you.
Well, otherwise I will be in the Discord.
Okay, yeah, if anyone has questions, we can take it to the chat so we can keep this session on time. Feel free to ask in the Discord chat. Well, thanks again, Martin, for a very interesting presentation. Next up, we have ExpReal, which is a system and writing language for authoring interactive narrative texts by Nicolas Zivas from the University of Geneva and Ruud de Jong and Maria Tuna from University of Twente. I believe several of the authors are here. Yes.
Hello? Can you see my screen?
Yes.
Good. So I'm Nicolas Zivas from the University of Geneva, and Ruud de Jong is also attending the talk today, so he can answer a question later. So we are going to talk about dialogue generation and authoring these dialogues in the context of interactive narrative, interactive drama. So In the last years, in the University of Geneva, we have been building several interactive drama systems and pieces. And the principle of this approach is that you have a narrative engine behind that make logical calculation about what should happen next in the story. So we use different kind of rule-based system for generate these actions. And then we get a logical form, and then we transform that logical form into a text. So we get something like inform, intention, speaker, listen, task, goal. So it's all logical. It's a predicate here, and we transform it into a dialogue between here, Paul and Olivia. I want to go to the circus with Lily, which is an instantiation. So we usually use a template-based system or recursive template. This is similar to, in the literature, what has been called, what is also used in terms of CFG, context-free grammars. It works well, but at some point we reach the limitation of those systems. For example, here we have, I want to go to the circus with Lily, but suppose Paul is not talking to Olivia, but to someone, a colleague who doesn't know who Lily is. So he would say, I want to go to the circus with my daughter. So he wouldn't say Lily. Or if he already spoke about his daughter before, he would say, I want to go to the circus with her. We call that a referring expression. And suppose he was not talking to Olivia, but to Lily herself, he would say, I want to go to the circus with you. So you get this issue of replacing names here, but you get more issues as well when you have complex generated situation. So we want to propose a new tool called ExpReal, and we have 4 requirements for this kind of tool. First, of course, we want correctness. The sentences need to be correct, and for sure, if you don't say, if you say Lily instead of you, it's not correct. We also want that this is readable for the author. That we don't want it to be a coding language. That is classical for template-based approaches. Also, we want some variability, as in the first talk. Having variable generated sentences is something important. Because if you meet the same situation, you don't necessarily want exactly the same sentence. And we want also, because we worked with an author before, we noticed that sometimes we have a general sentence to say, for example, inform, intention here, but the author was not quite satisfied because in that specific situation, he would have appreciated to have a more specific way to say things. So we want to mix very general way to say things and more specific ones. And we call that variable specificity. And this is the answer to this is ExpReal for Expressive Realizer. So the features of ExpReal are, it's template based. It is, as input, it is just CSV file. So it's basically anyone can write in a spreadsheet. So it's practical. It uses conditions. It uses linguistic processing, which is unusual for template-based approaches. It is multilingual, and it is open source. I will mostly focus here on these 2 aspects of ExpReal. I mentioned spreadsheet, so here's a copy of a spreadsheet that we will use in ExpReal. So we first have an element, a logical element to express, and we have a condition. Then we have the template in English, and then we have the template in French and in Dutch for the 3 languages that we have implemented so far. So in the first line, there is no condition. So this means it is the general form that that the system could use to express any appearance of an informed intention predicate. In the second line, this is more specific to a situation where the goal is playing karaoke. So I'd like to sing some songs. I love karaoke. So it's very specific to that situation. In the next one, you get another situation. And here, for example, you get even more specific because we want for this task, but also for this speaker and this listener. So we have something very specific, etc. So once we have written a certain number of lines, we need to select which one to take, which templates to take. And basically, we have a main rule here is the specificity rule. We will take the more specific formulation because a priori that's better. It is one that is more suited for this specific condition. And this is counted as the largest number of conditions. Then if after applying that rule, we have still several choices, it's not bad, then we can have a random rule and we have we satisfy the kind of variability. We can have several ways to say things. It's classical. We also have an overriding tag to have a condition that overrides the preceding rule, the other rules. So the syntax of conditions are easy. So we have the conjunction with the comma, we have equality, and we also have membership. This is not demonstrated here, but you can also specify that this is only available when this element is included in the set. Now let's look at the linguistic processing in ExpReal. So we do first the verb inflection. So in that sentence, Paola tries to be helpful. Of course, that could be I try to be helpful. It's not the same formulation. And it is written in that template with the braces, subject, verb, and they are into the brackets. So we don't have templates here. So how the system knows that try should be tries? In fact, we use another engine here, which is called Simple NLG, which is a surface realizer that is used elsewhere and has been developed for many years in other universities. And this engine has a knowledge that try can be inflected in tries if it's a third person in English, etc. So this is quite helpful for the system. We also do referring expression generation. So all these sentences, Paola helps Marion, I help Marion, etc. They are all generated by the same template where we specify where is the verb, where is the subject, where is the object. And by this specification, we are able to pick up the right way to generate the sentence, depending of the context here, who is the speaker and who is the listener. We also do, and it is not in Simple NLG, but something that we have programmed in ExpReal itself, what we call anaphoric expression. If we already mentioned Marion in that example, we would say Paola helps her and not Marion again. So there are some rules on when you put the pronoun and when you put the name, and we use the algorithm in that reference already developed more than 20 years ago in computational linguistics. So last thing that we do with linguistic processing is the ownership. So something like, is Julia's big red jacket, sorry, or it's my red jacket, big red jacket is written again with one template that specifies that Julia is the owner of the noun, the object before. And we had, sorry, an example in French, which is a translation, c'est la grande veste rouge de Julia. Here, the specificity of French is that the noun is not always at the end. Sometimes it's at the end, sometimes it's in the middle, so or the beginning. So you have to specify, tell the engine that this is the noun, because this is you have to know what possesses what. Okay. So we have used that in two systems, Gothic Girl and Alzheimer Care Trainer. The last one was presented three days ago. We didn't do formal evaluation, but we could use it quite well so far. Especially one author was the author of Gothic Girl and both of the system that we developed before, Nothing for Dinner, on ID tension, and he was quite happy with the system with condition, which allowed him to be more specific when he needed that. The next step for ExpReal is to better evaluate the usability, but also if people do use the features, because we realize that by putting these braces and this marking, etc., it may not be that intuitive to use ExpReal. So we want to test whether author would use them. We want richer data for conditions, like for example, it could be dependent on emotion that we have from the narrative engine. And we need new linguistic features, and not only in English, because English is, when you only work in English, you tend to avoid a lot of specificity of other languages, and even already in French, the pronominal verbs are not yet well processed. S'asseoir, sit down is much more complex to do in French, for example. And also we want to add new languages. The good news is that Simple NLG exists in several languages, so it will not be too much work to adapt to the language where Simple NLG is already developed. So we have a list here, for example. And finally, we want more users. So it's open source, so feel free to use it, feel free to contribute. It's a principle of it. Thank you. Merci. Thank you. I'm listening to your questions now.
Thank you, Nicholas. We have time for some questions.
And Ruth is here as well to answer questions.
I can ask one about the multilingual aspect. So you already gave examples in English and French, and you mentioned simple NLG supports more languages. Will your current approach and syntax work for very different languages, like say Chinese, which is less similar than say English and French?
For that, I will need to know more Chinese than I do currently. Chinese has good aspects because you have less inflection. In fact, you don't really have inflection because you add some things. So beyond the problem of character, which means only Chinese people could program that, it may not be more complex than on some aspects that will be easier, and I'm sure on some aspects that will be more complex. But it's maybe Ruth can answer better, but he's the more linguistic guy here. But at least we are happy because it's already in simple NLG. So things like inflection or change in tenses and things like that, I guess they are already basic linguistic things are already there. But there may be other phenomena that I ignore that may be complex. It's never straightforward because you have specific cases.
And to add to that, simple NLG itself, the syntax and API of simple NLG is tried to be as consistent as possible in between languages. So that already helps us a lot. And we also try to keep the syntax of ExpReal as close as possible between the languages. But I can imagine that if the grammar of a language changes or is so much different from the European languages that you actually need specific syntax parts that you can adapt syntax just for that language. We try to keep it the same, so it's easier for authors to translate and understand the context it's being used in. But of course, you can always specify further for other languages.
You can see it here, it's very similar between the two languages, but French or English are not a good example of distance languages.
Well, that is actually one example in which we don't really use those pipes in English because there's not really a need for it, but still the syntax could be used.
Okay, yeah, thanks a lot. Well, we should move on to the last talk of the session then. Thanks, Nicholas and Ruud.
Thank you.
The final talk is towards friendly mixed initiative procedural content generation, 3 pillars of industry. I believe Gorm Lai is presenting it, or it's a video. And I don't think I'm giving away anything confidential by saying this provoked quite a bit of discussion among the reviewers, so maybe it will among people here as well.
Hi, my name is Gorm Lai, and I'm from Goldsmiths University of London. And I'm here to present a position paper with the somewhat unwieldy title, Towards Friendly Mixed Initiative Procedural Content Generation, 3 Pillars of Industry. I come from a technical industry background and sometimes get a bit confused about who the audience is for certain academic PhD papers. The ideas are often very applied, yet they do not seem to cater towards practitioners. This does not mean the authors are against basic research. However, we are right now not talking about basic research. Especially when we talk about work on PhD, it is currently nearly always applied work. There are other areas where advanced research between academia and industry is being shared. For example, ACM-CGRAPH. Papers often have both a very strong theoretical foundation, as well as a focus on performance and adding details for implementation. From my own experience and interactions with other graphics programmers, I know a lot of developers look forward to CGRAPH and get strongly inspired by what is published there. Out of 163 technical papers presented at CGRAPH 2020, at least 37% of them had industry participation. Can we do something similar for PCG? Of course we can, but then we need to make a concerted effort. To get closer to this goal, we present 3 design pillars for academic research on mixed initiative PCG tools. The 3 pillars are: respect designer control, respect the creative process, and respect existing work processes. Respect Designer Control asks the question, does the algorithm provide enough control for the designer to express their vision? Can we compete with manual labor? Respect the Creative Process concerns itself with providing a short iterative loop that provides enough feedback to the user that it does not break their creative process. And finally, Respect Existing Work Processes focuses on the ease of embedding PCT tools into an organization with an existing workflow that already combines a number of other tools. We are, of course, not the first to think these thoughts. Norman and Draper, in their book on user-centered design, introduces the two concepts, the gulf of evaluation and the gulf of execution. The gulf of evaluation is how easy it is for a user to perceive representations and feedback, and the gulf of execution is how easy it is to accomplish a given task. The gulf of execution is an important concept for respecting designer control. Shortening the gulf of evaluation and the gulf of execution are important parts of respecting the creative process, as both are parts of the iterative creative loop. Moving on from general user experience to mixed initiative interfaces, in one of the earliest publications on the subject, Horvitz lists 12 principles for MI interfaces with direct manipulation. The first of these deals with the question, is the tool actually adding value? For example, does this tool enable me to achieve my goal? And can I perform my task without losing focus? Lambie states, manual creation strengths are PCG's weaknesses. Manual methods give the control the designer ultimately wants, but does not provide the automation and potential speed up in work process that some PCG tools can provide. Thus, the impossible sounding goal is to create a tool that works with the speed of automation and the control of manual labor. Jingold's Magic Crayons embody this approach as they enable authors to obtain satisfactory results with a small amount of effort, artistically expressive, and are magic because they're imbued with the power of computation. What happens if we don't respect designer control? User fatigue sets in, as Leibniz et al. Describes. User fatigue is what happens when, in this case, a PCG tool does not allow the designer to converge fast enough on their stated goal. In this case, the designer loses focus and avoids using the tool. If possible, perhaps they'll even look for an alternative. When making changes to procedurally generated content, the goal is that the iteration must be so fast that it can compete with the instant feedback of manual labor. Compton introduces an iterative feedback loop that she calls the grok loop. It has 4 stages: build a hypothesis, modify the model, evaluate the result, and update the model. Compton mostly focuses on casual creators, but Fales and Olson introduces a similar loop for interactive machine learning with 3 stages instead of 4 that they classify under the principle of fast and focused. Looking at the game Red Dead Redemption 2, over 3,000 people worked on it. That means when we change or introduce new workflows, to minimize risk, we'll often most have to focus on local optimizations. Global optimizations such as changing a game engine or restructuring processes and teams are often deemed too costly and risky. To make a tool easy and cost-effective to adapt, it should only affect the workflow of the people on the team using it. For example, if 2 artists A and B work on the same asset at different points in the pipeline, and B is dependent on A's output, a PCG tool to optimize parts of A's workflow should output assets in a format that B can work with. To better support our argument, in the paper we look at 2 case studies. One focused on the pillars respect designer control and respect the creative process, and the last one focuses on respect existing work processes. If we look at the development of the evolutionary dungeon designer, users asked for more local control and a way to highlight design patterns. In the end of our survey, the authors conclude, to a certain extent, controllability is preferred than expressivity, as the users continuously try to impose their vision. And they continue, users are more likely to sacrifice to a certain degree expressivity and exploration of the tool by gaining control over the generated content. Thus, we are back at Lambie's statement that manual creation strengths are PCG's weaknesses. This presentation was very short, but here and in the paper, we have argued through literature and case studies that to make our research on mixed initiative PCG tools more attractive to practitioners, we need to stick to at least 3 design pillars: respect designer control, respect the creative processes, respect existing work processes. PCG tends to be applied and tangible work, and thus it could potentially be more interesting to industry and other practitioners. Of course, we want more integration in both ways, not just from the ivory tower to the real world, but also the other way. However, that is a presentation for another time. These are my references. Any questions?
Thank you. We have time for a few questions before the next session starts, if anyone wants to start.
Oh, sorry. I can elaborate on Forward's question. Sorry, Mark, I didn't mean to take over from you.
No, totally fine.
Yeah, so there was some of the discussion centered around, I guess, a lot of academics have often been told you need to work more with industry, and that point got a lot of attention, and especially one of the reviewers got quite upset by this. And actually, that wasn't really my point. Like, but I think there's all sorts of research, and all of it is justified. All I was saying is, if you make something that is very applied and could potentially be interesting for industry, maybe it's worth going that extra mile. I wasn't really sort of interested in taking that debate if people who make game engines should decide what we teach at the university level. So there was that sort of conflict in there too. Another reviewer talked about how they felt that it was some of these rules were common sense, which I sort of agree on, but I think still it's worth summarizing the findings and putting them together in a central place, pulling in other people's findings and then adding them together. Of course, the next step for this would be to, instead of using other people's data, to create my own data, our own data, and do a future survey on this. Yeah. For Tom Betts, yeah, maybe I'm also starting to wonder how much of it is actually, because this is very central about PCG, but I mean, these design pillars are not necessarily only for PCG, and I would like to expand that in the future. It's just mixed initiative is a very central part of my PhD, and so that's my starting point and a lot of the reading material I had. But it could be interesting to expand from out of that. I'm not sure what do I pronounce it right? DVH means exactly. What the question is about. About applying these 3 pillars.
Well, one interpretation, you can jump in if you're wrong, is should academics, instead of like writing the PCG prototype, actually build some kind of like, usable tool that someone in the games industry could use, like some other.
Okay. Yeah, I don't know. I think where I sometimes just found that PCG applications, they're often very elaborate, and there's a lot of effort has clearly been put into making this nice application. And I thought maybe then it's worth making these extra considerations that I feel would be important for practitioners, which we have argued are important for practitioners. Instead, so I would either go that way and put a bit more effort into those things and think about those things, since we've put all this effort into making an actual nice application, or pull it back a little bit and then making something that may be a bit more simple, and just to exemplify the things that I want to talk about in the paper. Now, sometimes they're in a midway that yeah.
Okay, so one last question from Jim Whitehead before we wrap up. He was wondering if there's other design pillars besides these three. Like he suggests maybe near real-time interactive speed is important for industry users of PCG systems.
Yeah, so that's a central part of I tried to distill it down, so I had more. So the real-time part is very central to the pillar that's called respect the creative process, because it's about staying in that loop, iterative loop of mind where you can stay focused on your task, and real time, and having a short grok loop, as Compton calls it, is very important, where I get instant feedback and can reflect on it and make a change. So it's reflected there already.
Okay, well, thanks a lot. Thanks to all the questions and all the presenters in this session. We'll wrap up here, and then starting right afterwards in a few minutes, there will be the HCI and player experience track in this room and the game criticism and analysis track in room 2, if you'd like to attend the next ones. Thanks a lot.
Thank you.